Good afternoon and welcome back to the POLITICO Healthcare Summit. I'm Helen Collis, a health reporter for POLITICO, and this next session will be discussing the speed of innovation. Within a year of the pandemic, highly successful vaccines as well as treatments were being administered to millions of people throughout the world. It was an unprecedented feat, and the result of concerted effort and collaboration from scientists, industry, regulators, doctors, clinical trial investigators, and patients. Today, we're going to discuss how that was made possible, what lessons can be learnt from that experience, and if that speed of innovation can be sustained in more normal times. But before we start, a few housekeeping rules. Please do ask questions on the Swap Card app. All the instructions are on the event website. You can ask questions if you're using your desktop on the bottom right of your screen, and if you're on your phone, you can ask them below the live stream. And if you're in the room with us today, the instructions for how to access the Swap Card are on your chairs. Also, if you're tweeting about the event, please use the hashtag #PoliticoHealthcare. Okay, we have an excellent panel lined up to debate the speed of innovation today. First, we have Sue Forder. Sue is Vice President of Global Regulatory Affairs at Lilly. Hello, Sue.
Hello, everybody.
Next, we have Marco Cavaleri, Head of Biological Health Threats and Vaccine Strategy at the European Medicines Agency. Welcome, Marco.
Hello to all of you.
We have Patrick Bertrand, Founder and Director of Global Health Advocates, a non-governmental organisation that focuses on engaging all sections of society to fight diseases. Welcome, Patrick.
Hello, everybody.
And Peter Marks, Director of the Centre for Biological Evaluation and Research at the US Food and Drug Administration. Welcome, Peter.
Good day.
We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to jump straight into questions today. On November the 9th in 2020, Lilly was the first company globally to provide a new medicine designed specifically to treat COVID-19. That was after the FDA authorized the emergency use of its monoclonal antibody and later followed by a combination of two antibodies. Sue, what was different about that fast-track process for Lilly in engaging with the regulators, both in the US with its emergency use authorization, but also in Europe?
So, first of all, I think that we have to commend the regulators really in all the major jurisdictions for the fantastic effort that they made to speed up the availability of medicines in the COVID epidemic for patients. And I think that there were a couple of things which were absolutely outstanding, in particular, the ability to talk to the regulators more easily and also the flexibilities that they were able to invoke. Now, in the US, there was the advantage that they had the emergency use authorization. And I think that that gave them a legal framework that they were able to provide these medicines. In Europe, we didn't have an emergency use authorization, but I think that our regulators, both at the EMA and the member states, were very creative in using some very specific sentences that they had in their legislation so that they were able to give this access. And through that, we had a number of flexibilities that were implemented. And I think that the EU Commission now has a fabulous opportunity when they revamp the legislation to take the best of what was learned and put it into the legislation so that we have a wonderful pharmaceutical legislation for the future, which will support.
We're having a few technical issues here. We've lost Sue momentarily.
More quickly than currently available today. I think I'm here.
You're back with us, Sue. But I think we got the gist of your message, and more flexibilities from both sides and the legal framework in the US to allow that emergency use authorization. Peter, I'd like to bring you in here to give us some insight from the US. Obviously, unlike Europe, the US had this legal framework with its emergency use authorizations. What does make that process quicker? And what part of the assessment is dropped, for example, compared to an accelerated approval, which is probably the most comparable to Europe's conditional marketing authorization?
Yeah, so emergency use authorization in the United States allows us to have tremendous flexibility in how we go about dealing with the authorization of products in a declared public health emergency, and that flexibility is so great that in the case of vaccines, we used our guidance process just to limit it a little bit, to say that we're actually going to hold vaccines to a slightly higher standard, or a somewhat higher standard than the minimum floor of what emergency use authorization requires. Emergency use authorization, our requirement is the product may be effective and the known and potential benefits have to outweigh the known and potential risks. Not a very high bar. We're allowed to waive many of the manufacturing requirements if we need to. And that's if we need to. So for the vaccines being used in healthy people, we decided that we would require at least some of the type of manufacturing conformance that we normally require, not the full conformance process that we need for manufacturing. We did scale back inspections initially, and we did not require the full 6 months or 12 months of follow-up that you would normally have from a vaccine clinical trial. We scaled that back to a median 2-month follow-up for the vaccine randomized trials. And that allowed us to move much more nimbly. But I just go back and say one other thing that really made a big difference was the amount of interaction that we were able to have with the companies along this process, which I think really helped things. And I think that's a theme that I hope we can find ways to continue post-pandemic, even though it does draw a tremendous amount of resource needs from the agency. Randomized trials.
I see. I'm having some technical issues myself here. Marco, the European Medicines Agency used the rolling review process and the conditional marketing authorizations to speed up its reviews of treatments and vaccines in the pandemic, but it did still fall behind the US and the UK in its speed. Should Europe reconsider how it assesses vaccines and treatments in an emergency like this?
Yeah, I'm still hearing Peter talking, so there are some technical problems.
Marco, I'm having the same issue here. I think if we wait just a couple of moments, it should pass. Marketing authorizations to speed up its reviews of. Sorry about this. Okay, I think we're good to go. Did you hear the question, Marco? Would you like me to repeat it? Should Europe reconsider how it assesses vaccines and treatments in an emergency like this? Okay. Marco, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear your problems.
We're still having a few technical issues. I'm sorry about this, everyone. This is what happens on a live event. Typically my first live event as well. So sorry about this. Okay, I think we're good to go. Did you hear the question, Marco? Okay. Okay, I'm terribly sorry. Yeah, the stream is going back on repeat. Marco, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Unfortunately, there is a bit of an echo, and so the question goes on and on. I will dream about it tonight.
Okay, I'm going to try that again, and I'm hoping that now we have our technical issues sorted. Marco, if you're still with us, yes, I wanted to hear your view on what your thoughts are about whether or not Europe should reassess how it reviews vaccines and treatments during a pandemic. Okay.
An echo, and so the question goes on and on.
I'm not sure if Marco can hear me now. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, we're still having a few technical issues with this feed. Okay. We okay? Okay, let's try again. Marco, can you hear me? No. We can't hear Marco. I think I'll try somebody else. Patrick, I haven't brought you into the conversation yet. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Oh, great, and we can hear you too.
Oh, perfect. Cross our fingers.
So we've heard about some of the differences between the European process and the US process in reviewing medicines and vaccines more quickly during a pandemic, and support of speeding up the European process, potentially with something a bit like what the US offers. Do you have any concerns around the acceleration of development of authorizations of new vaccines and treatments, speaking for civil society?
Yeah, and I was thinking, as you know, we are not a technical agency. We are advocates for global health and advocating for access for health for all. And frankly, what we have, the speed discussion is more for us a question to raise the issue of something that was mentioned several times this morning already. At the beginning of this discussion is of the speakers is the question of transparency and transparency on priority settings. On decision makings or what should be where the money should go, and transparency also on how progress have been monitored and our progress has been with what kind of indicators we should set up and be able to see what kind of the investment, what is the impact of the investment on societal impact. And that's just two things. We just done as a GHA, as Global Health Advocate, a study 2 years ago before the pandemic, showing that most of the money that is going to research and innovation from the European Commission right now is going to diseases that are part of WHO priority list, and that's with a system of decision making that are not transparent, and that is not also that is highlighting a little bit too much the power of the pharma industry, of the private sectors, and that's really something that we highlighted, and that's something that we can see that impact in the preparedness and the actual pandemic and the preparedness of the pandemic. And second thing is that one thing that we have been working for quite some time, and if you think about some diseases and something also that was mentioned by one of the prior speakers on antimicrobial resistance is the question of tuberculosis, for example. We know that tuberculosis is killing more than 1.4 million people per year, and more than HIV and malaria. But we still don't have enough investment of the European Commission on R&D for vaccine or for new tools for TB, and that's concerning. And for diseases that is also airborne.
Very interesting. So we're looking at the speed of innovation, not just for things in a pandemic, but for much more chronic diseases and other infectious diseases that are also killing, hundreds of thousands of people each year. Sue, I'd love to bring you in to comment on this. What's your take on ensuring the right balance here? Do you think industry's role in prioritizing which pathogens to target and treat has been in the best interests of global health? And if not, what is the best approach?
Well, I certainly think that during the pandemic, the industry rose to the challenge. And so I think that we can all be quite happy with the contribution that the industry made for both the therapeutics and the vaccines. And I think that we are all interested in bringing solutions to patients for unmet medical needs. And there's any number of unmet medical needs, unfortunately. And what we're looking for is a regulatory system which will allow us to bring these innovative medicines in a timely way, in a predictable way. And we want an agile regulatory authority to work with. And certainly, the FDA, as has just been mentioned during the pandemic, it was absolutely revolutionary the way the industry was able to talk to the regulators. And to some extent, I think that was also the case in Europe. And what we're hoping for is that now, for the first time since 2005, the legislation will be revised. I think that there were plenty of opportunities that the EMA knows exactly where it wants to go when it published its paper in 2018 for the strategy to 2025. And what we're really looking for is that there's an opportunity to implement many of the proposals that were made, and many of those proposals, in fact, were implemented by the EMA during the pandemic. And then we should have a good way of going forwards.
Thank you, Sue. Marco, I'm going to try and come back to you again, and I'd love to talk to you about clinical trials during the pandemic. We've seen huge developments in clinical trials over the last couple of years, from remote access for participants to real-world evidence generation and large evolving trials like the recovery trial in the UK. But it seems that these huge phase 3 efficacy trials have been one of the real biggest hold-ups in delivering vaccines quickly. Do you think there is a better model for generating data quickly on the safety and efficacy of vaccines or treatments in an emergency? And if so, what could a new model look like?
Yeah, I would agree there has been quite a bit of learning throughout this pandemic with respect to clinical trials. And I have to say that anyway, the clinical trials for the vaccines have been moving quite fast, particularly for the front runner. And indeed, it's been incredible what has been achieved in a matter of few months compared to what we normally see with the clinical development of vaccines. And at the basis of such success, there has been a huge collaboration between the private and the public sector, the intense efforts that have been put forward, not only by companies, but also by funding from governments and others. And I think this is one of the important learning. I also believe that what we've seen so far, that randomized control trial remain essential in order to derive what is the efficacy and the safety of therapeutics particularly, but also for vaccines. And we should think indeed about how to create a better infrastructure at regional, but also global level in order to make sure that there is a coherent research agenda for clinical trials that allow us to move rapidly into studying the important question and achieving the results that we need to have without the fragmentation that we have seen, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, with many groups repeating the same trial, but with a sample size that would not be sufficient to really determine the efficacy of certain drugs that were investigated for COVID. So here we should join forces, create infrastructure, create a network and platform trials that can conduct rapidly the studies that we need in order to get an answer as soon as possible.
And what about the technologies out there for modelling, looking at animal models, but also AI modelling? Do you think we'll see a day where testing in humans won't even happen before the first vaccine is administered?
I think this is very important in the context of preparedness because, of course, here we are talking about a rather reactive scenario in which we were caught by surprise by this new virus emerging, and we had to come out rapidly with repurposed agents or developing very rapidly new ones or new vaccines in order to be able to tackle this pandemic. But in the ideal world, we should do a lot of work before the actual crisis. We should advance vaccines and therapeutics before we have a big problem like this one, so that we have something ready right from the start of any emerging health threat, and we are able to tackle it. And for this, indeed, the new tools and new advancement into the science and the regulatory science are so important, including understanding what we can achieve with animal model, what we can achieve with the human challenge model, what can we learn from platform technology, and in other words, how we can move faster before the crisis in having a portfolio of options that can be used straight away.
Peter, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. The US Food and Drug Administration has been world-leading in its speed of authorizations. What's your take on potentially approving the vaccines of the future in an emergency on maybe just a small group of people who have volunteered for a challenge trial and relying more on sort of pharmacokinetic and dynamic models using new technology?
So I have two parts to my answer here. One is, I think, obviously, it's very reasonable in emergency situations to consider what can be done with animal studies. We have an animal rule which allows us to use safety studies from humans and efficacy from animals. That's a possibility. There could be modeling. But, you know, at the end of the day, I want to be a little provocative here. I'm not sure that the clinical trials were really the major rate limiting step. I mean, yes, they were large clinical trials. They were done relatively efficiently. It took a while to have manufacturing scale up to find the fill-finish capacity that was necessary to follow up on the bioreactor capacity in some cases, or the manufacturing capacity that had to be put in place to make large-scale amounts of these vaccines. So I think if you are taking an approach where you are manufacturing at risk while you're conducting clinical trials, I'm not sure we lost an incredible amount of time there. And at the same time, we had the greater certainty of having had the vaccines have some real safety data in humans. That was very helpful to us because without that, I suspect that our high level of vaccine hesitancy in the United States would be even higher.
Thank you. Sue, I'd like to talk to you about this manufacturing scale-up issue. Making monoclonal antibodies is notoriously difficult and quite a time-consuming process. To what extent should pharmaceutical companies be scaling up manufacturing at risk for new products that potentially might not get approved, for pathogens that potentially might not be such a big problem in the future?
Well, I think that's a huge. I think that the scaling up is hugely difficult, and I think that one shouldn't underestimate the technical challenges associated with the scaling up. So I'm not too sure how you can scale up something when you don't actually know what you're making. So I think that really the society, and maybe that some of the future health agencies, maybe that's something that one can discuss that in a more holistic way, thinking about what is the best way of being prepared for the future. I mean, specifically on clinical trials, and where we looked at just continuing advancing our clinical trial program for innovative products, I think that we actually learned quite a lot, and we learned some additional flexibilities that hopefully we will be able to implement to do more efficient clinical trials. And historically, only 5% of eligible patients have actually been able to enroll in clinical trials. And during this period, we were able to use more decentralized processes. We were able to widen visits. We were able to ship medicines directly. And these are all key learnings, which I think in terms of running trials for innovative medicines should be very helpful for the future. And I think that it's one of the many learnings that we can take.
Thank you. And Patrick, what's your thought on this? I know that your organisation has commented previously that there hasn't been enough transparency in the clinical trials. What's your take on the fact that only 5% of people actually participated? This could be much higher. How do you think this could pan out in future?
Sorry, it was breaking at the end. I didn't hear you. Sorry for that.
I know your organisation has commented. Can you hear me?
Yes, now.
Great. Has commented that there's been a lack of transparency around the clinical trials processes. Where do you see improvements being made in the future to get more people involved?
Yeah, and I think what the current crisis show also that there is also questions of inclusiveness on clinical trials, especially around the scientific community in Africa and in Asia, and that's really something that we think that we talk about equity and equity in terms of access to products. We need to also think about having a system where the clinical trials team from countries that are not European for this discussion have the same access to funding and the same access to information. And that's something really concerning for us. And also something that we think are important on the setup of clinical trials, we should also include some access conditionality at the beginning, because most of the clinical trials money is coming from public money and for taxpayer money, as our colleagues in the US usually mention. And we need to be sure that the results of these clinical trials are accessible for everybody, and also that the products that will be following this clinical trial will be accessible for everybody.
I'd like to stay with you, Patrick, and bring in your thoughts about the European Health Emergency Preparedness Authority, which we've talked about earlier on. among some of your organisation's concerns are the undue influence of industry over medical developments and public grants. How, in your view, should HERA operate, especially in funding research and the development for new treatments and vaccines, so that it is more transparent?
Yeah. And thanks for the question. As global health advocates, we welcome the creation of HERA with the substantial funding that HERA has been able to mobilize. For us, it's a great step in pandemic preparedness, but we think that HERA has to find the right formula between parity between public and private actors, and that is not worked. That is work is guided on by genuine public health interest. That's the major thing for us. And as a member of the European Alliance for Responsible R&D and Affordable Medicine, we are proposing, and this alliance will issue a letter to the European Commission and the member states in the coming days. We are proposing some recommendation to HERA around, basically, I want to summarize not to be too long, but one thing that is important, obviously, and it was mentioned in the previous also discussion, is the question of governance rules, accountability, transparency standard of HERA is not really clear for us. Having also an inclusive HERA where patients, researchers are sitting on the same at the table, but at the same level, and not only be informed. And then we know that's something that the European Parliament is taking seriously, and we are happy to see that they are following and pushing on that issues. And we also think that HERA needs a global vision and not only focus on Europe, but also focus on the link with other initiatives, not only BARDA, but also some initiative in African countries, for example. And finally, I think we need to, and I said that previously, it needs to have very clear and very strict access conditionality to this funding and procurement. And that's something very, very important for the equity and for the affordability of products, for the transparency and the access to results. Thanks.
Thank you, Patrick. And Sue, I'd love to bring you in here. If there is more transparency around the grants and money funneled into the development of new products, do you think there should be more transparency over the contracts signed, for example, with the Commission, if joint procurement is something we're going to see in the future? Where do you stand on transparency over contracts?
Well, I must admit that I'm Vice President of Global Regulatory Affairs, and signing procurement contracts is not my responsibility or my particular area of interest. So I'm afraid I recluse myself from that particular question.
Fair enough. We just have a couple of minutes left remaining. So I have one final question for all of you, if you can, it will be the same question to each of you. So if we have one important lesson that we can take home from the pandemic on speeding the or accelerating the development of vaccines and medicines in the future safely, what would it be? And I will start with Marco.
Yeah, I think I said for me the preparedness topic is very important. I've been working on preparedness with WHO in several groups, including for coronaviruses. And I remember in 2018, we were noting that nobody was doing or putting a lot of efforts into finding drugs or vaccines for this type of viruses. And one of the few exceptions was a laboratory in Oxford. So I think we have to do better to increase our ability to have different players involved into coming up with countermeasures, both in terms of therapeutics and vaccine, before the actual crisis. And then once the crisis arrives, work together. So the international collaboration is also another key element.
Thank you. And Peter?
Yeah, thanks. I'll pick up where Marco just left off, which is that I think as we move into what will undoubtedly be further pandemics or epidemics in the coming years, we as advanced regulators have much more in common than we have in terms of differences. And I think in these situations, if we can harmonize, come together, we can probably do things much more efficiently, working with industry, essentially with a convergent, harmonized approach utilizing harmonized application processes and potentially even dividing up some of the evaluation processes and then having mutual reliance so that our individual countries are not as taxed by the needs here. And that way we can actually probably provide better feedback to those who are developing products.
Thank you. Patrick.
And something that I think that this crisis also taught us is that we need at European level a renewed global health strategy. And a global health strategy that include not only development issues, but also include EU health, and that include also research and development. And lots of people are talking about lack of coordination, lack of cooperation. It's only with a real clear global health strategy that done in an inclusive way, developed in an inclusive way, with clear indicators that we will be able to tackle the next pandemics.
Thank you. And lastly, Sue.
So I think that the collaboration between the regulators and with the industry all around the world was fabulous. I think that implementing the clinical trials is super important, and that I would say what we need to keep a really careful eye is the implementation in Europe of the clinical trials regulation. We need to make that a success, and we need to make sure that if there is a pandemic and we have to do everything really fast, we don't have to find workarounds. We have to be able to work through that EMA portal. And for me, therefore, I think that we just need to be very, very careful, make sure that that's fit for purpose, because I'm worried it's going to be very complicated, and we don't want that. We want to be able to do these future trials in a very efficient, streamlined way.
Thank you very much. Well, we're out of time. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Marco, Peter, Patrick, and Sue, for your very interesting discussion. We now have a networking break of 25 minutes, and then after that, we will return for a panel discussion on what to expect and when from the pharmaceutical strategy, and that will be moderated by my colleague, Marco Martuscelli. Thank you, and enjoy the break.